Alright, so in this tutorial we're going to be going through the custom controls creator, and just as the name says, this program allows you to create your own custom controls without having to write any code by hand. So here's the interface. It's pretty simple. On the left side we have a blank canvas, and this is going to show you exactly how your control is going to look within After Effects. Right now you can see it's just the name with the reset button, which actually does nothing. It's just there to make it look just like it does in After Effects, and an empty canvas. And then over on the right side you can see there's 3 different sections and the generate code button. So this will be, once you're done, you'll click this to generate your code. But before that, we have the controls section, where you can see we have these 8 different buttons that allow you to add the different types of controls. We have the project settings section, and there's 2 options, the composition dimensions and the bits per channel. Now these don't apply to every control, but I'll talk more about these once we run into the controls that actually use them. And then finally we have the control settings, and this is where we can set things like the control's name, the match name, but also this bottom area will change depending on what control we've added to allow us to set things like the slider min and max, or the color that we want to be selected by default, and so on. Now before we start to add controls, let me talk about the title bar area up here. When we click on the title bar, we get these settings over here, and the first you can see are control name and match name. Now the control name, this is actually something that applies to every single control in your pseudo effect. But for the title bar, the control name is actually going to be what the user is going to see the control named as when they apply it to a layer. The match name is important for a different reason. The user probably will never see the match name, but it's very important that you set this to something custom for when it's added to the preset effects.xml. You want to make sure that this is something unique to you and your control. If you left this as default, or if you set it to something that's already being used by another control, you're going to cause errors when a user tries to install it, and it's going to possibly mess up everything that you've created. So you should be sure to create something unique, and you might want to follow the same style as Adobe's done here. Adobe always puts the prefix ADBE in all capital letters before their control names. And so you can do the same for your match names, or you can come up with something completely different. It's just very important that the match name that you create is unique to you and your control. So let's get started by adding a control. Now up here you can see we have these 8 different buttons, and these icons represent the different controls, but if you have trouble seeing what they are or need to know, just hover over and you'll get a little pop-up that says slider, angle, color, point, pop-up, layer, checkbox, and group. So those are 8 different choices, and there's 2 different methods you can use to add them to our list over here. One is to click them, and you can see it looks just like it would within After Effects. You can drag the slider and the value updates. Now, one thing to remember when you're creating controls in here is that this is just set up as a visual representation, and the values you're setting are going to be what's set as the default value. And what the default value is when the user drags your preset on, or when they hit the reset button, these will be the values that your control will be set back to. So if this is set to 0, then when the reset button's clicked, the slider is going to go back to 0. If we want to start it with a value of 10, we can type in 10 here, and now it'll be set to 10 instead of 0. Now, you can see that I've been playing with the different options over here, but we also have the control settings over here. Changing the default value in this area will also change the default value over here. So both methods will actually do the exact same thing. It's just personal preference on how you'd prefer to set the settings. Now there's also some settings such as the valid min and valid max that you can't set in this area because it's not something that's visible in After Effects, but you can set it over here. So let's talk about all these controls. First we have the control name, which is the name that's displayed for the certain control. So you can see that as we change the control name down here, it updates over here. We can also change it over in this area. And once we click out, you can see it updates over here. So next we have the slider min, default value, and slider max. And these are the values that the slider can reach. So for instance, if we change the slider min from -100 to 0, you can see that that changes the lower value over here, and now the slider will only go between 0 and 100 rather than -100 and +100. Now the default value is what we already discussed. It'll set the default value that's set when you either drag the control on or hit the reset button. And then the slider maximum is just the opposite of the slider minimum. So let's say we make this 200. You can see it updates over here and changes the position of this slider to match the value. Now, the valid minimum and valid maximum are the values that this can be dragged to. So in After Effects, the slider has a minimum maximum, but you can usually push those values even higher. You just don't see a change in the slider. What we do with these values is say we want to be able to let the user go past 200 all the way to 500, but we don't want them to be able to go past 500. So what we can do there is set the valid maximum to 500 rather than 1000. And you can see that because this was set to 5 at one point, it changed the other values. So you want to actually set the valid min and valid max first before you go through and set all of your slider values. So we'll set this to 500. We'll set this back up to 200. And we'll set the default to, say, 50. And now we can drag it up to 200 and we can push this up to 500. And you can see that now once we hit 500, it's not going any higher. And it's the exact same, but on the other end for the slider minimum. If we put it to negative 500 rather than negative 1000, then as we drag this value lower, you can see it hits 0, the bottom of the slider, and we can keep on pushing this all the way to negative 500. Now, in the middle down here, we have the precision value, and it's by default set to 2, and what this is referring to is the amount of digits after the decimal point. So you can see right now we have 2 zeros following 500. If we change this to 4, we'll get 4 zeros. And that's just the precision, the amount of digits we can get after the decimal point. So for instance, we can change this to 100.1234, and it will keep track of those last 4 decimals. If we change it back up to 2, you can see it cuts off those last 2. And that can go all the way up to 9 decimal places if you need your control to be that precise. Then at the bottom we have these 3 checkboxes. Now, almost every control has this can have keyframes checkbox. And what this is asking is, do you want the user to be able to set keyframes for this control? Do you want the stopwatch to be visible? So by default, that's going to be checked. If we uncheck it, now the user won't be able to have keyframes on this control. And you can see that the stopwatch icon has been turned off. It no longer is clicked in. Now in After Effects, what this would mean is that there's just no keyframes on the layer. In this case, it means that either keyframes are not allowed, or if it's clicked in, keyframes are allowed. So when you see it like this in the Custom Controls Creator, when you see that this button is not pressed down, in After Effects, this actually won't be visible at all. So keyframes are available and keyframes are not. So if you don't want the user to be able to keyframe the properties, uncheck this checkbox or unpress this button. Display percent just adds a percent symbol after the value. So if your slider value is referring to a percentage of something, then you might want to add that percent symbol just to make it even clearer what you're controlling there. And then we have display pixel. Now this is a little bit confusing, and it's also one of the controls that corresponds to this bits per channel up in the project settings. Now I'm going to change these values to make it a little bit simpler to understand what's going on when we use this display pixel option. So let me change this from 200 down to 1. Now you can see right now we just have 0 to 1, with the default being 1. It doesn't really matter. If we turn on the display pixel and our bits per channel are set to 8, then when we turn this on, our value of 1 is going to change to 255. Now the reason for that is because with 8-bit color, each channel has 256 different possibilities, being 0 to 255 for those color options. So what we've done is make our slider correspond to the bit depth of our project. Now say the project wasn't 8 bits per channel, it was 16 bits per channel. You can see now that it's changed from 255 to 32,768, which is the amount of colors per channel when you're using 16-bit color. And then we also have 32 bits per channel, which is floating point, and you can see we get the floating point values. Now one thing to keep in mind is that changing the bits per channel is not going to affect settings within After Effects. It's just to give you a visualization of what your control will look like depending on what the user has set. So this isn't going to force the user to use 8-bit, 16, or 32 bits. It's just to give you an idea of what your control is going to look like. And if none of your sliders are using that display pixel option, then the bits per channel setting up here isn't going to affect anything in your control. It's only if you're using that display pixel option. So that's it for the slider control, which is actually the most complicated control out of all of them. So next, let's move on to the angle control. And as you can see, it's just as we have it in After Effects. You can see over here we have the number of degrees rotated plus the number of rotations. And then we also have our little graphic interface that we can use to change the values. Once again, we have the same option of can have keyframes. We have the same control name option. And then we also have the number of rotations and degrees. So this number and this number correspond to this and this. So, like before, you can choose to set your values over in this area, or you can set them in the control settings area. Doesn't matter. Both are the same. It's just a matter of personal preference. Next, we have the color control. And this is another simple one. The color shown up here is the color that will be selected by default. And you can see we have the eyedropper. The eyedropper is another one of those things that's just to make it look like it does in After Effects. In this program, it doesn't actually have any function. It's just there for visuals. Now, to change the default color, you can either click here or in the big color swatch over here. Click on that and it brings up the normal color picking option box. And you can set your values just as you would in any other software. You can click and drag to choose a value graphically, or you can use the HSB or the RGB selections over here, or you can use hexadecimal. Doesn't matter how you select them. You can see your color up in this top area, and once you're happy with your color, just hit OK, and it will change in your control. And just like most of the other controls, you have the can have keyframes option. Next, we have the point control, and this is another tricky one to set up. So you can see over here in the control settings area, we have the point X% and the point Y%. But then we also have the point X value and the point Y value, and both of those two have a star next to them. Now the reason for this star is that these values correspond to the width and height of the user's composition dimensions. So basically what this means is that you aren't able, using Pseudo Effects, you are not able to set exact values for what you want your point control to be set to. For instance, you can't say I want my point to always be set to 100 by 100. It's not always going to work out. What you're actually setting is the percentages. You can say I want the point to be 50% across the composition and 50% down the composition, which is what it's set to here. And that would put your point directly in the middle. Or you could say you want it to be 0.25 and 0.25, and that will put it a quarter of the way across and a quarter of the way down. But you're not actually setting the X and Y values. Now what this is displaying down here is what the X and Y values would be if the composition settings were set to 1920 by 1080. So if you're at HD 1080, this is the values that you would get with the point X% and the point Y% both set to 25. So it's a little bit confusing to think about. It's similar to the bits per channel option. Basically, these are just for you to play around with to see different options that your user might be using and how that will affect where your points are. But in the end, what you have to remember is that the point X% and the point Y% are what actually will be setting the value of your point's coordinates. You cannot set the values explicitly. So that's pretty much it for the point control. Once again, we have the can have keyframes, just like all the rest. But let's move on to the pop-up control. Now this one's a little bit different. Until not too long ago, this control didn't really have great availability within Pseudo Effects, so it's a little bit new. But basically what it is it gives you a drop-down. And the drop-down's pretty similar to the layer control drop-down, except you can set the values to whatever you want them to be. Now, by default, it's just going to be set to empty, and that will be the only option. But you can add all of your own options simply by typing in this box. And you can see now we have the option of 1 instead of it saying empty. And to create a second option, all you have to do is put a comma and type your second option. Now you can see as easy as that, we now have two separate options in our pop-up control. And you can have as many options as you want. And every time you put a comma, it's going to add a new line. Now, once again, this drop down over here is the exact same as this drop down over here. What this is going to do is set the option that's selected by default. So right now, the option 1 is going to be set by default, but we can change that to 3. And then when the user drops your control on, 3 is going to be selected by default. And when we hit the reset button, 3 will go back to being selected. Now one thing to keep in mind I've been doing some testing with pop-up controls, and it seems that if you keep your options too short, for instance, if we had the numbers 1, 2, and 3, this might give you an error when you try to apply the pop-up control. So try to keep the names a little bit longer. But that's it for the pop-up control. Has the other two same options as all the other controls. Let's move on to the layer control. You can see it looks very similar to the pop-up control, except that there's only one option, which is default to current layer. So the two options are for it to default to the current layer, which is the layer that it's applied to, or default to none. So what the layer control actually does is, in your composition, let's say you have 10 layers. Well, then in this layer dropdown, it'll have 10 options, or actually 11 options if you include the none option. But it'll have those 10 layers shown, and you can choose a certain layer so that you can base your control on another layer. So your choices for defaults are either to set it to none by default, so no layer selected, or it will select by default the layer that this control is applied to. So that's what that control does, and you can see that that's the only option. This is the one control that gives you no choice. You cannot have keyframes on a layer selection dropdown. Next we have the checkbox option, the checkbox control. And it's another really simple one. It's either checked or unchecked by default. So these two do the same thing. You can see that as I check it over here, it checks over here, and vice versa. And once again, we have the can have keyframes option. Now the last control over here actually isn't a control at all, it's the group option. And what this allows you to do is organize your controls and place them into groups, just to make everything more organized and easier to work with. Now to get controls into your groups, there's a few different ways to do it. When you first add a control, that group will then become selected. So by adding more controls, the following controls that you add will automatically be added into that group. And you can see that compared to the options up above, these ones down here are now indented. If we close this group, you can see that we've closed out the options that used to be displayed down here. But if we click back into the main area, or any of the other controls that aren't inside the group, now this main area is once again going to become active. So if we choose to add another control, you can see that this slider control is no longer inside that group. So what we can do to add controls into the group again is select the group and then continue to add controls. And you can see now that that group was selected, we're once again adding controls inside of it. Or you can click and drag directly into the group itself. Now in the group's control settings, you have a table that shows all of the controls that are contained within that group. And you can see the order that they're in. Now right now, since I haven't set any of the names of these controls, you can see that this isn't very helpful. But if we had these named to something a little bit more helpful for us, and obviously if you were making a real control, these would have actual names, so you would be able to tell them apart. But what this allows us to do is not only see all of the controls that are in the group, but it also allows us to reorganize them. So say we want to move slider 2 above slider 1. All you have to do is click to select it, and then you can click one of the two arrows over here. Hitting the up arrow will move it above the other slider, and you can see that also changed where it appears over here. Or you can hit the down arrow to move it down below the next control. Now this is actually one of the two ways you can use to reorganize the order of your controls. The other way to do it is if you move your mouse over to the left side of one of the controls, you can see you get the hand cursor and you can see these little grips that come up. Now there actually are different levels of grips. Right now I'm selected on the slider, which is inside the group, and you can see that the grip only goes from the top to the bottom of the slider control. But if I move out a little bit further, you can see this is a very large grip, which is actually controlling the entire group. So this grip will go from the top to the bottom of the group, and if you go in, it goes from top to bottom of that particular control. And if we close this down, you can see that now it's only as tall as the group control when it's closed. And all you have to do is click and drag, and you get the little darkened line that will show you where that object is going to be placed, and you let go. And now that slider that was at the bottom is now moved up to this area. You can also use that to move controls from outside to inside of groups, or from inside to outside. So say we want to take slider 1 and we want to move it out and to the top of the control. Click, drag, and now it's been taken out of that group and placed to the top. And we can do the same thing backwards take a control from out here, drag it right into the group, and now that control is contained within our group. Now one last thing we can do is delete the control. So say we make a control but we no longer want it. All you have to do is come over to this little trash can symbol, click that, and it will delete the control. If you delete a group, it's going to delete everything inside. And so on. Now, once we've created the control and we have everything exactly as we want it, we can hit the Generate Code button, and it's going to bring up another window. And you can see here we have all of the XML that's needed for our control, and then at the bottom we have a bunch of different options. Now, the top two are for using and saving your XML code. The first option is to copy it, and if you click on that, you can see a little pop-up comes up here. It says Pseudo Effect XML has been copied to the clipboard, and if I bring over a text editor and hit paste, you can see that we've now pasted our control into the text editor. We also have the option to save XML code. What this allows you to do is rather than copy and paste it into text editor, you can actually create a standalone XML file that you can then open up and change however you'd like or use in the Pseudo Effect Builder, which will be talked about in another tutorial. The second row has 3 different options for getting your control into After Effects, and this is for you to use it. So we have the copy import script, and this is just a very simple After Effects script that will allow you to import your new control and apply it to a layer in your project. And this will be gone over in the tutorial on importing controls into After Effects. We also have these 2 other options, which are copy auto import script or save auto import script. Now what the auto import scripts do is allow you to place a script into the startup folder of After Effects. And what the startup folder is a list of scripts that are automatically run when After Effects is started. Now what this script does is exactly the same as what the manual import script does, except it's going to run when After Effects opens up, and then it's going to delete itself. It's going to delete the file so that it only imports the script one time, which is going to be the first time you open After Effects after installing it. So you can choose to either copy that script or save it directly. And then our last row here is the how-to videos, which just links you to these tutorials that you're watching in case you need a refresher on anything that you're doing. And then we have the close button. So that's really it for the Custom Controls Creator. In the next tutorial, we're going to be using the Custom Controls Creator to create the Simple Graphs control. So let's get started on that.